Hello, everybody. We're live, and we are live with a new webinar. And this time, it's a webinar that's in English because today we have a guest from the United States. It's John Spencer. He's a very, very inspiring educator. He's written 3 books, and he's going to share his story about his latest book with us, the book called Vintage Innovation. Let's see if John is there. Hey, John.
Yeah,
Hey there.
I am here.
How are you doing?
It's nice. It's 11 a.m. where I am, so
Okay.
it's sunny. It's cool, but not cold, so it's really nice.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. So strange times, right? Nowadays.
Yeah.
What do you notice in your setting, in your education right now? What do you see?
Yeah. So I'm doing a lot of work with professors who are moving to distance learning, and then a lot of work with K-12 teachers who are doing the same thing. And I think there's a lot of fear and uncertainty and a lot of chaos. And for a lot of people, it's the first time that they've been in this space of doing virtual and online and hybrid stuff. And so it's just been it's been a lot of that kind of work.
Hmm. But they are doing well
Yeah.
right now, or not? They're trying their best.
I think they're struggling. I think a lot of people are struggling. I think we're all doing the best that we can, but I think a lot of people, they just weren't prepared for it, and so it's a lot of experimenting and seeing what works, and then moving on. And but then in the midst of it, it's just been amazing to see how dedicated teachers are, and how great they've been. There's been so many really cool grassroots, from the bottom up type of innovation that's happening in the schools. And I think that's been kind of the silver lining of all of this.
Yeah, that's very cool. Good to hear. We met each other 3.5 years ago during the first edition of the Educational Design Expedition. You were one of our 2 keynote speakers back then. And
Yeah.
I'm very enlightened that you made time for us this evening, or this morning for you, to share your story about your latest book, Vintage Innovation. I'd like to give you the stage. Give it up for John Spencer. Everybody at home, give a big round of applause. John, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So ahead of time, I just want to say there's some places you can follow me if you want to connect. I'm on Twitter @SpencerIdeas, so feel free to direct message me there, tweet me there. I promise that I do not tweet like our president. So if you're worried about how Americans tweet, I'm not like our president. I have a lot of these sketch videos that you'll see. I love to draw and make these videos at spencervideos.com, and my blog is spencerauthor.com. I've been putting together some distance learning resources. I just today did one about how to kind of maximize and improve your virtual settings as well. So, if you're doing virtual meetings. And then again, please feel free to email me if you have questions. If you're curious about anything, it's john@spencerauthor.com. So here's where you can't follow me. So just a heads up. Make sure that there's some boundaries there. Although since I'm in the U.S., there's a good likelihood that you wouldn't follow me. But the last one is a Death Cab for Cutie song, so I don't know if anyone caught that, but I'll say that. I want to start by sharing a quick story about meaningful learning that I experienced as a kid, and then move that into the big ideas of this concept of vintage innovation. So I want to share one sentence that changed my world, and a little bit of a background. I was born in the Ice Age. It's where I learned how to stop and collaborate and listen. If you had told me as a kid that Ice-T would be, playing a cop on television, I would have told you were crazy. But that was it. I was a definite child of the 80s, and this was cutting edge. This was the big, technology that we had. And who I was in middle school was I was incredibly shy and incredibly nerdy. I had one friend, we'll call him Matt, since that's his name. And we were 2 nerds in a pod. We hung out every single day at lunchtime. As long as I had Matt there, I was good. I would spend my time talking about history and architecture and old baseball stadiums and sports and music. And we would debate, which band was better, the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. And that's not even a contest. It's definitely the Beatles. And my whole goal was to be invisible. I went through middle school, through grades, 6, 7, and 8, just wanting to not be noticed, wanting to blend in as best as possible. And then there was one particular day where Matt was sick, and it had never occurred to me. He always showed up to school every day. It never occurred to me that he might miss school. And so I showed up to lunch, and Matt wasn't there. And I stood there with my cafeteria tray, and I just waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I kept hoping that somebody would invite me to their table, and that never, ever happened. And so I threw my food away, and I hid in the restroom, hung out right by a toilet, and just waited for lunchtime to be over. Now, the reality of it was I wanted to be invisible, and I was invisible. But I was not invisible to two teachers, Mrs. Smoot and Mr. Darrow. They knew me as a person. They knew me as an individual. And they knew that I cared about justice issues. They knew that I cared about social issues in our world. They knew that I loved baseball. And they knew that I geeked out on history, that I was a huge fan of history. And so they invited me to be part of a competition, a big creative competition called the History Day Project. Now, a little bit about the History Day Project. It's a year-long hands-on project. And the truth is, I went through a period that I would almost call it like a detox period of school, because as much as I loved having choice in what I did, I didn't know what to do in this project. I came up with a list of topics, and I brought it to Mrs. Smoot, and I said, which topic should I choose? And she said, which one is going to sustain your interest for the entire year? And so finally, it took me a long time, but I chose the integration of baseball, the story of Jackie Robinson, and how sports actually can connect to civil rights. And then I began to do research. But when I did research, I wasn't sure where to start. So I asked, where do I start? And she said, well, what interests you? What do you want to do? And I wanted to know, how do you want my research? Do you want note cards? Do you want a binder? Do you want this? Do you want that? Because every teacher had always told me exactly what to do in school. And Mrs. Smoot didn't tell me what to do. She basically said, you've got to figure it out on your own. And I remember at one point being so angry that I came home and I told my parents, my teacher's not helping me. And their answer was, good, she shouldn't be. And I realized, I've got to figure this stuff out on my own. I began to do research, and I fell in love with the topic, but I would still have moments that were terrifying. I would make these phone calls to former baseball players, and I hate making phone calls, and I would be so nervous. And there were days that I just didn't even want to work on this, but then every single time I would be so glad that I did. Half the time I'd be so nervous that I would, whisper on the phone, and I would say, I'm John Spencer, and I'm from. And of course, the person on the other line is probably thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. They're whisper talking. What's going on? Because that's what happens on the movies. And then every time I would be so enlightened by hearing the stories of these former players and finding out things like, a lot of them were very politically active, and you don't hear about that because you just think they're athletes, they're doing sports. And so I went through this whole project, and then at the very end, we went to a radio studio to record my voice. And I played my voice, the script back to me. And this is, of course, being a child of the 80s, you don't know how your voice sounds being recorded. It just wasn't available to us. And I heard my voice for the first time played back to me, and I said, I quit. I'm not going to do this. And that was the sentence that changed my world forever. When Mrs. Smoot said, when you hide your voice, you rob the world of creativity, and I'm not going to let you do that. Now, Mrs. Smoot was why I became a teacher. She was my hero, and she still is. I believed in my core that making is magic and that classrooms should be bastions of creativity and wonder. And yet, as I think about it, all of the technology that we used in that project is completely obsolete. We don't use any of it. When I recorded my voice, I used reel-to-reel tape and had to use a razor blade and Scotch tape to tape it together. When I made my slides for my presentation, I had to use a physical camera, take the pictures, take it to the store, and wait a week to get these little slides back that we used. I have really important skills like how to unjam a slide projector that I will never ever use. When I did research, we didn't have the internet, so research was basically going to the library and using microfilm and microfiche. Some of you might remember that. Some of you might think like, what in the world is that? I've never even used it, but that's how we had to do research. So all of the technology that I used was obsolete. But on the other hand, the skills I learned are timeless. So yeah, I may not make slide presentations the same way at all. Obviously, the way I do slides here is I like to sketch them by hand, and I use Photoshop and Keynote and have this blend that goes together. But what I did learn was how to communicate visually, right? I may not use the phone to make phone calls, but I learned how to communicate. I learned critical thinking. I learned these critical creative skills that became the soft skills I use for a lifetime. If we think about it, our world is changing. We see it all the time. The things that required physical stuff back in the day, we now, have on our cell phones. I remember a couple years ago, there was a game, and my daughter said, "Dad, you've got to check this new game out. It's called Crossy Road." And I played it for about 2 minutes and then realized, no, this is Frogger. We used to play it as a kid. My wife and I were in the car, and we were on a road trip. And we were driving down to California, and we noticed that we weren't fighting with each other. And every time my parents and her parents, when we were kids, when they would go on road trips, they would always argue. And so we started congratulating ourselves on having a good marriage and being better communicators and everything. And then I realized, wait a second, my parents always fought over the map. Now we just have, Google Maps. Like Google saved our marriage. We're good, right? And so all of this physical stuff used to require, physical things we now have on our devices. My daughter asked this question, "Dad, were you alive back when people had flip phones?" And I tried to explain to her that our house had one phone when I was a kid, and we would have to walk through the kitchen, and it was like that scene from The Matrix where there's, you're like moving back and forth and dodging things because, we had this 90-foot cord that wrapped all around the kitchen. That's what we had back in the day. It used to take hours to make a mixtape, right? When I was a kid, a teenager, to make that epic Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Soundgarden tape, you'd have to sit there in front of the boombox and press your finger on the record button and just wait for that epic song to play. Just kidding. It was totally like Boyz II Men. But the point is, we would have to wait forever to do that, right? And now they just say, "Alexa, play my favorite song." I mean, before there was Siri, we had Clippy, and Clippy was this thing that popped up every time you opened up a Word document, and Clippy would tell you, exactly what to do. But that was the closest thing we had to it. And now we're at the beginning stages of AI, and virtual reality, and augmented reality, machine learning. Things are changing at a breakneck pace. We have this amazing connective and creative power at the palm of our hands. And yet, when I looked at this, when I did a student survey to see, to what extent do students actually use their devices creatively, I found that they almost all consume rather than create. 158 out of 160 consumed video, but barely any of them actually had created and edited video themselves. 159 out of 160 had consumed audio, and only 3 of them had actually created any kind of audio. 152 out of 160 had played games, but none of them had created games with things like Scratch. The bottom line is students aren't digital natives, they're consumer natives. And I mention this because right now my kids are on distance learning. And you know what they're doing on distance learning? They're doing worksheets. They're doing handouts. They're basically doing online the same type of stuff that you would do in person with paper and pencil. None of them have been asked to create videos. to create podcasts, to blog, to do anything like that. They're basically watching a video of a teacher lecture, and then they're doing a worksheet that goes with that. And that shouldn't surprise us. They're consumer natives. If you look at the most popular YouTube channels for kids ages, say 5 to 8, they are unboxing videos. If you don't know what an unboxing video is, it's literally somebody opening up a box and telling you what's inside of it. It's someone who looks at what's in the box and says, this is what's inside of it. And the reality is, that's in many cases what we've reinforced in school. They're consumer natives. And we as adults aren't all that different. I remember my daughter wanted to watch an unboxing video, and I said, no, we're not going to do unboxing videos. We're going to make something instead. And then 2 hours later, I was sitting there with my wife watching this show, House Hunters, where it's basically people decide between what 3 houses they want. It's the same thing as an unboxing video, just for grown-ups. Now, why is this the case? We've had this consumer mentality in schools where kids passively consume content. It's this one-size-fits-all factory model. And that's why we use phrases like, did the kids get it? Or, I'm delivering a lesson. But one-size-fits-all is great for socks, but it's a bad model for the mind. For years, we've been given this formula that if you work hard at school and you graduate from a university, and then you climb the corporate ladder. But given these changes that we see, we know that this formula has changed. That the ladder is now a maze. We see tons of disruptions in every industry, and we're just beginning to see it with, again, things like machine learning and augmented reality and AI, and we're just in the early stages of this. And so there's a tendency in schools to say, okay, well, everything's changing. Let's prepare students for the future. But the problem with this is it leads to a place of futurism. It leads to a place where you say, I'm going to prepare you for the future. And yet the reality is you can't always predict the future. And I mention this because when I was that same 8th grader, we had a teacher who called the entire class up to the very front of the room and said, this will change education forever. Now, if you're not familiar with this, this is a laser disc. And this teacher said, this will replace teachers someday. Students will be able to come to the front of the room and they will check out these laser discs, and then they will take them to a room where they listen to and watch the laser disc on their own, right? The reality is this did not transform learning forever. If you think about 20, 30 years later, nobody has laser discs, but everybody still has teachers. It did not change education forever. Technology does not transform learning. Teachers transform learning. And that's the heart of this idea of vintage innovation. So one of the core ideas is that we go vintage. And what I mean about this, I'm going to skip forward, is if we think about this core idea that we can't predict the future, then the problem with trying to predict the future is that we often have those laser disc moments, right? We choose things that we think students will need in the future, and then it turns out that it's not that important. I'll give a small example. Schools all over the US are really emphasizing this idea that every kid needs to learn how to code. They all need to learn how to program. But now there's a lot of people in the coding and programming community who are saying, actually, engineering is going to be more important because a lot of the code that's going to be written is going to be written by AI. And that's an example of saying, futurism. We're going to try to predict what kids need in the future. Meanwhile, there's this reality. And the reality is that the best way to prepare students for the future is by empowering them in the present. It's by thinking about those soft skills that they're going to need for the rest of their life. And some of this comes down to redefining the way that we think about relevance. Instead of thinking about this is relevant because it's flashy and new, we say this is relevant because it's better and different. And this helps us avoid some of those big fads. In the US, for example, we had this trend where everybody wanted interactive whiteboards. If you think about smart boards and active boards and whatnot. And schools spent so much money outfitting classrooms with these interactive whiteboards. And it was promised that it would change things forever and it would get better and everything. And I'm a techie. I'm someone who loves technology. But I actually asked not to have an interactive whiteboard because a traditional whiteboard actually worked better for my classroom. And that's a small example of flashy new versus better and different. And in the meantime, now many of these schools have these outdated interactive whiteboards that they spend millions of dollars on as an institution to outfit every single, school with these. And they're outdated and they don't work well. And that's because they chose flashy and new rather than better and different. So if we think about this, we want them to develop that maker mindset. We want them to learn things like project management and empathy. We want them to become systems thinkers and hackers and rebels. We want them to be unabashedly different. We want them to be ready for the creative economy. And that's part of the power of vintage innovation. So I want to take a dive into this idea. Vintage innovation is the overlap between best practices and next practices. So it's the idea of saying, let's not abandon what works. Let's keep what works because it's really good. But let's also focus on next practices and let's see how those two fit together. Let's see how they overlap. Vintage innovation is the idea of combining lo-fi tools with high-tech tools. I'll give a small example. There's a local school right now that is students are at home and they are networked together and they are doing something very lo-fi. They are sewing masks for people so that you can have a mask when you go out to public. But they're also combining these with 3D printers to have to make the masks more wearable and more durable and things like that. That's the overlap between the lo-fi and the high-tech. It's also the idea of the tried and true and the never tried. So what does vintage innovation mean for students? In a world of constant change, our students are going to need to be divergent thinkers. It's the idea that they have to be wildly and unabashedly different. So much of the future is programmed. But if you think about the fact that it's programmed, what's going to distinguish them surrounded by AI and machine learning and automation is the ability to think outside the box. And it's not just to be able to think outside the box, but it's the idea of repurposing the box. One of my favorite small ways to do this is to incorporate, really quick divergent thinking challenges for students. I actually did this with my students recently, and I teach at the university level. And our warm-up when we did our video conference and met together was I gave them an assignment to find 5 different random objects in their house, right? So I said, you got to find an object that's round, an object that's sharp, an object that's blue, an object that's... Then they had to find these random objects. And then what I told them to do is they had 10 minutes working with a partner, right? With different items, working with a partner. And they had to together walk themselves through, within this creative constraint to create 2 different children's toys with those random objects. And that's the idea of divergent thinking. It's the idea of, yes, AI can solve problems and it can do an amazing job with analytical processes. But what we do best as humans is to be able to think divergently. And I love the definition of divergent thinking as functional novelty, right? It's the ability to come up with something that's entirely new, but is also purely functional. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that and incorporate divergent thinking into lessons. In a world of endless possibilities, our students need to be curious. This is the idea that students should leave school more curious rather than less curious. And one of the things I find tragic is that so often the trajectory of students is that when they come in as 5-year-olds or 4-year-olds into schooling, they are super curious. They're filled with wonder. They're just desiring to know everything about life. And then there's this winnowing down that happens, and they begin to become less and less curious as time goes on. I was talking to a teacher who worked on design thinking with students, and the 7-year-olds had so many questions that this teacher struggled to keep up, right? They had so many questions that they were doing before the research phase. The 13-year-olds were down to about two to three questions. And then you would think that the secondary students, the high school students, would be excelling, right? But what this teacher found is that the 17-year-olds just wanted to know, is this graded? What is it going to look like in terms of the mark that I get? Will this connect to the test? And it just struck this teacher that the older that students got, the less curious they got. And yet in life, being more knowledgeable makes you more curious, not less curious, right? You don't see cosmologists who just don't have any questions about the universe anymore. You don't see engineers who quit asking, how does this work, right? You don't see artists who quit asking, how did you do that? I've never seen a musician who stops getting curious about music. Like, being more into something should make you more curious, not less curious. And yet in school, too often, we have this thing that goes on where the longer that they're in it, the less curious they get. So this means having students ask tons of questions. It means having students chase their curiosity. I love this example of a second and third grade class, and I got to observe it back when I was teaching grade 8. And I asked this teacher, how are your students, asking such great questions and mine are struggling? And she said, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask a question. And so I began to think, we need to intentionally incorporate questions into our daily routines, but we also need to allow students to know that there's nothing wrong with asking a question, that they don't have to be afraid to ask a question. One of my favorite small examples of this is to just do a Wonder Day project. And a Wonder Day project is you take one class period, it only takes one class period, and you allow students to ask any question they want connecting to what you've been learning about. And then from there, they engage in their own, original research. They go online, they find it, and then they present it in a podcast. So we used to do these things called curiosity casts, and students would ask these questions connecting to history or connecting to science. And in the end, they had these podcasts. And I knew that it was working well when students started to, on their own, voluntarily listen to each other's podcasts. And I would see them listening to it on the way to school or on the way back from school as they were walking. And it told me, this is working because if you got someone else curious about what you're curious about, it becomes contagious and it becomes a part of the classroom culture. In an automated world, our students need analog tools. And this is the idea that often the best choice in technology is a roll of duct tape. I love this example of a makerspace. I mentioned that there's a really cool makerspace where students have been, sewing masks. And what's cool about it is the students on their own have continued to work on these projects even amidst the distance learning. And this is just a small example of, it's a makerspace, but it's also very lo-fi. It's very tactile. It's very hands-on. And yet they also have, a 3D printer. So there's this overlap between those. And I mention this because one of my favorite examples of analog tools in the real world is, if you think about the future of space travel, the biggest innovations that are happening right now are happening by people who study origami. And you don't necessarily think like, oh, origami is the future of space travel. But it's an ancient art, right? And it's very lo-fi, but they add together these complex equations and digital modeling to their process. So they have this overlap between the analog and the digital altogether. In a connected world, our students need empathy. So there is nothing fancy about printing masks for people. There's nothing fancy about that kind of a sewing project. But the reason it works, the reason it's successful, is that it's being done out of a place of empathy. And if you think about our world right now, we have so many disconcerting things that we're seeing. You see a rise in hate crimes. You're seeing a rise in intolerance toward other people. You're seeing this rise of the far right in a lot of places. In the US, we certainly see it with the rise of Trump and the rhetoric. And I would argue that this empathy that they get from doing meaningful, empathy-driven projects are not only important for future jobs, but they're important just to become the people we want them to be. And yet also at the same time, empathy is a critical component of design. I'm going to give a really dumb example. Just bear with me. When I was a kid, things didn't have wheels that should have wheels. If you wanted to have luggage, you had to carry luggage physically. If you wanted to take out the garbage, you had to carry the garbage can down a driveway over to where the garbage was picked up. Now those things have wheels. Now putting wheels on a garbage can is not that difficult of an engineering project. Putting wheels on luggage was not that big of an engineering feat. But what made it significant was that both of those designs were driven by empathy, driven by people saying, let's design for the user rather than trying to force the user to fit into our design. One of my favorite examples, and I don't have the video here for it, the audio for it, but is this American Girl doll. And for years, American Girl dolls were getting more inclusive. They were more diverse. But it took somebody outside of the organization to allow people to send in their American Girl dolls, and they would have prosthetic legs or arms so that they had dolls that actually represented them. And that's the power of empathy. For us, we had a big empathy-driven solution to a community graffiti problem. We kept painting over the graffiti over and over and over again, and every time it would just pop back up. And so finally, we did a little Shark Tank project. And in the end, they had to pitch their ideas. They worked in groups. They did research. They had to pitch their ideas to a panel. And the panel included the principal, a community activist, and a small business owner. And then the panel would choose the winning project. And I said, you have to begin with empathy. So they did community needs assessments. They did these Google Forms where they gathered the data. And in the end, the one that was the most empathetic was actually the group that went to the people who had gotten caught doing vandalism, the people who had been doing graffiti all over the community. And they talked to the police department, and they worked with people who were doing restitution. And they came back with this map, and they found that there were locations that were left alone. There was a beautiful church that was left alone. There was a gorgeous library that was left alone. But the back of the Walmart was completely covered in graffiti. And I still remember that in their pitch, they said, what if school looked more like a beautiful sacred space like that library, and it looked less like the back of a Walmart? And so their solution was to do murals. And so for the next 3 years, they painted 8 different murals. And again, that was an empathy-driven solution because there was actually no graffiti. The graffiti completely went down at our school. In a globalized world, our students need to embrace the local community. This is the idea of connecting with the local community in order to have a bigger globalized picture. And we found this in our students, even though they were low income and they were poor, they worked with a food bank, and they did community service, and then they helped pitch proposals to the local government about how to streamline processes and improve them. And it was a powerful way that they learned global citizenship by studying the local community first. One of my favorite examples is a board game project where students worked with a retirement facility and like an old folks home. I don't know if you all use that term in the Netherlands, but and they built empathy with the people who were there. And in the end, they designed these board games. And again, it was a very blended process because they had laser printers, they had CAD machines, they had 3D printers, but then they were also there physically. They were drawing things out by hand. And in the end, what the power in their board games came from the empathy. And they found things like a lot of board games that some of the older generation loved didn't exist in large print. And so they struggled to be able to play certain games. So these students designed the board game and then they played them with the people at the retirement facility. And then afterwards, they left the games there. And several of them came back on their own just for fun, just because they built up these relationships. And they found that a lot of the games were still being played, the next year and the year after. To me, that's the power of empathy. And it may seem small. It may seem like, it's not a big deal. It's a group of 12-year-olds who created this. But just think about what lifelong soft skills they're developing through that project. It also means that they're learning how to collaborate. They're learning how to communicate. They're learning what it means to actually think about power dynamics. And we want to think too about what happens when they launch their work to an audience. So one of the powerful things about this is a true empathy-driven project. They find their creative voice. They engage in iterative thinking, and they learn how to have productive struggle. They grow more empathetic. They become fearless. They embrace constructive criticism. They develop a growth mindset. The next piece I want to point out is this. I mentioned the future of space travel, and I want to point out that I'm just going to have you do this right now, real quickly. Chime in on the comments if you can. The future of travel is A, B, C, or D. Better engines, better combustible engines, improved flux capacitors, geckos, or internal pulse plasma propulsion. So I want you to choose one of those. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to do that. All right, the correct answer was actually geckos. So if you chose A, combustible engines don't work in space, so you don't want to use those. Improved flux capacitors, that comes from the movie Back to the Future. So, if you chose that, it's incorrect. The correct answer is geckos. And the reason why is that gecko feet are the key to having better adhesives. If you think about spacecraft, they're essentially glued together. And by studying gecko feet, you have a better picture of what it means to have adhesives that will work out in space. And that cuts to this idea of in a virtual reality world, right, where so many things are virtual, our students need the natural world. And I point this out because one of the things I see right now in my neighborhood is that we are on lockdown, which means we're not supposed to visit people's homes. We can't go to restaurants, things like that. But what people are beginning to do all over the place is they're rediscovering the natural world. I see so many people going on walks, and they're choosing this to be a break from learning. But what we know from the research is that when you go on a walk out in nature, that's actually when a lot of the synaptic connections happen. That's when a lot of divergent thinking happens. And actually, that's what will often lead to inspiration on your creative work. And so I would argue that this, quote, break from work might not be such a break from work. It's actually exactly what you need to be more productive and to be a better thinker. This is the idea of that a makerspace is great, but so is a garden, and that students need to have access on a regular basis to natural spaces. We had snow where we live, which is not very common. We don't get a ton of snow, but we had snow and everything shut down. And through playing in the snow and being in the snow, my oldest son, who's now a couple years older than this, asked the question, what happens, what will melt snow the fastest? And so this exposure to the natural world had him curious. And from there, he began to test out all of these different things to see what will melt snow the fastest. And in the end, he learned it was rubbing alcohol. And that led to him, trying out different recipes to see what would work best as a de-icer to get rid of ice. Now, that's just a small example of how the natural world inspires creativity and design. The next one is, in a world of instant information, our students will need to be curators. So they are bombarded with information. And curation is the idea of developing those big geeky interests. That in the future, as you think about being an expert, people can access information anywhere at any time. What you provide that's different is the curation that you've done, the way you've assembled the information, the way that you can organize it, the connections that you see between ideas. That's what's going to allow students to stand out in the future. And if we think about it this way, I mentioned before consuming versus creating, but the reality is critical consuming is vital for creative work. Right? And so when they are critical consumers, when they have that critical eye, that leads to inspiration, which leads to creative work, which leads to better critical consuming. Now, I know that I'm talking to some Dutch people here, and I know that the Dutch are not hard at all about being critical. I learned that when I was there in person. The Dutch are much, much more blunt about being critical than Americans tend to be. But I do want to say, we want students engaging in that critical consuming. We want them to develop tastes in things. And so if we think about curation, it's one part critical lens, one part celebration. This is the idea that you are a critic, but you're not just being negative in being critical. You're also celebrating the things that you love. Curation is the idea of having students chase their geeky interests. It's doing things like a Genius Hour project, or it's the idea of taking a couple of days off from the traditional classroom and letting them pursue some passion project within that. I love that this girl, Isabel, we did our Genius Hour blogs, and she did a biology blog, and now years later, she's getting a degree in biology. And meanwhile, other kids were doing video games, and yet what were they supposed to be learning? How to read and write and research. And they were both doing that, and yet we could still at the same time have them chasing their geeky interests. The curation process, I'll just point out, involves things like learning how to find where good resources are. It involves making connections between ideas. The best curators are able to share information with others. And they do so in a way that is concise and to the point. And so that's why we want them to be curators, because regardless of what job they have in the future, they're going to have to be that way. Final thought is this, that innovation requires courage. It requires taking a risk as professionals. And, we know this, that if you ask this question, am I sure this will work? If the answer is yes, then you get the status quo. You get the same thing that you've always had, right? But if the answer is no, I'm not sure this will work, that's where innovation happens. And I can tell you from working with professors right now who are for the first time ever doing distance learning, some of them are just leaning in hard to the status quo, and they are doing, getting in front of a Zoom session and talking for an hour and giving a lecture. And others are saying, wait, this is my chance to innovate. I don't know if this is going to work, but I can't teach the way I've always taught. So let me try something different. And they're trying things that are totally different and new along the way. The bottom line is that failure is permanent, but failing is temporary. And we want students to learn how to fail forward, but that means as educators, we need to be able to do the same thing. We need to learn how to fail forward as well. And it's the idea of treating every single lesson as an experiment. And so that's the core idea of vintage innovation. Should I exit my slideshow now, Frank?
You can. If you are done with your story, thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you very much. For people who want to ask a question, in the question window over there, you can ask your questions if you want to, and we will present them to John, or your experiences or stuff like that. I've written down some things myself, and what I've written down, the first thing was that I'm very curious, what are your thoughts on what makes us consumer natives? What's where does it come from? because back in the days when we had to survive in prehistorical days, we weren't those consuming natives. So what happened over time? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think part of my take is, the Industrial Revolution, certainly it's the way we all live in, capitalist societies. And
Hmm.
I think there's even been a shift that places that have been social democracies have shifted um, away from even social democracy and further toward, you know, um, capitalism in everything. And if I'm thinking about when I was growing up, it was in the midst of the Cold War, and then when the Cold War was over, it just seemed to be, sending the message that, okay, well, that's the answer. And so,
Hmm.
if you think about it, we're just in a culture. All of us are in a culture of consuming, and that brings us some really good things. I'm not trying to be to say that capitalism is awful or evil or anything,
Hmm.
but it just means that from a young age we grow up in that. And again, my example of the YouTube video, that was eye opening to just see I guess sort of the indoctrination of unboxing videos
Hmm.
at a young age. It was mind blowing to me as a dad to see this and to realize this is our reality.
It's strange, right?
Yeah.
It's very, very strange. Do you think that these times that we are living in right now, the things that are happening right now, that has an impact on that consuming mindset?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I can't speak for too many other contexts outside of
Mm.
where I am, but I think there's a lot of people who are sort of avoiding consumerism a little bit right now. There's a I you know so many people I know are baking things
Mm.
by hand. I asked my students to to do like a little show and tell
Mm.
when we met, and I said, choose one item, and I gave them 90 seconds to find an item in their house that represented a healthy way that you're handling quarantine. And so many of them, they brought like a mixer or a guitar or this or that, and so many of them said, like, I haven't picked up a guitar in 5 years, and now
Mm.
I've gotten back into playing guitar. And so I think there's a little bit of a um, with so many things closed, people are rediscovering in
Mm.
a healthy way that life isn't 100% about consuming. But then we're all getting the message where I am. We're all getting the message that the economy is going to go down. So, here's $1,200. You better spend it.
Yeah.
so,
Keep,
so it's a little bit.
keep everything running, right?
Yeah, there's this push toward, like, I don't know how permanent this movement away from it is. I
Mm.
will say, there's, in a really healthy way, there's been a lot of teachers saying, let's reimagine what education can be
Mm.
as a result of this. And that, I think, has been one of the healthiest responses, whether it's been teachers who are saying we need to think hard about equity and access and the underserved students who are slipping through the cracks, to teachers saying, well, let's rethink the way we do instruction. In fact, like, I've had a lot of conversations about this, even this idea of vintage innovation. And if students are at home learning and they're doing distance learning, that doesn't mean they have to be 100% in front of a screen the whole time, right? They can
Mm.
go do a maker project. They could sew masks, like I mentioned. They could, build something. My kids were, making pinball machines with duct tape and cardboard, and it wasn't for school. But why couldn't that have been school?
Yeah.
I think so. I do think it's a chance to reimagine things a little bit.
Yeah, that's beautiful because I see the same happening with my two small children. I have two boys from 3 and 5 years old, and they
Hmm.
somehow they get out to discover more instead of they're more out on discovery instead of sitting in a classroom. And
Mm-hmm.
what I was wondering is, do you think that how longer this will take, the bigger the revolution in education will be? Because that's what I tend to see over here. We had at the beginning we thought maybe after 4 weeks all of this will be over and we will just go back to the old ways. And now everybody starts to realize that this might take about 6 months or so, So we have to reimagine our education. Do you think that that plays a role, an important role?
Yeah. No, I definitely think that. Mm-hmm. And what I love about your observation is that's right, that the reimagining of education that's going on isn't just teachers, right? It's parents, it's families, it's the community rethinking what education can be. And I think that's pretty exciting. Of course, teachers should be leading the charge, and of course, teachers are the professionals, and we need to honor their autonomy and their expertise. But like your observation about discovery learning, how many parents are discovering that for the first time?
True. True. I have 2 questions. I had 3 actually, but Emma, she asked a question. She said, "I wonder what the smallest thing is you ever did that caused creativity." And she said, you already answered it by finding the object and challenging students to find the object that for them had to do with the quarantine. Sorry, my English. But do you have another example of that? Just the smallest thing you ever did that caused creativity.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of ways that we could just incorporate more creative thought into what we do. But I used to do little like 2 or 3 minute activities that were super fast. So I would say things like, I want you to change one letter in a sports team to come up with something new, and then defend why they're better, like why it's a better thing for the city. So like if for football, we have the Chicago Bears, and someone would say the Chicago Bears because Chicago loves beer, right?
Okay,
that kind of thing, right? They would have to make their defense. Another small example of that is like really small is students came in and I said, all right, I want you to come up with a to-do list for villains, right?
Yeah.
And I gave them an example. I actually have a sketch video for this, right? So Darth Vader, like what does Darth Vader do on his day off? Like he gets his asthma inhaler refilled, obviously, because he's clearly got asthma. He binge watches the Golden Girls. He's doing hot yoga. What does he do? And it's a small. I call it like stupid creativity, right? It's so small and so stupid, but it gets you thinking about people in a different way.
Yeah.
So that then when we talk about villains, like the villains in history that we think of as monsters, what makes them so scary is that they're also human, right? Like that they're not Darth Vader. They're people who had families and childhood and would have seemed so normal. So even though it was a very silly example that was very creative, it made it that much more meaningful when we got into a really hard, darker topic of genocide, which is what the topic was,
Okay, cool. I have a question from Marike. And that question combines with the question from Monique. Monique is saying, I wish we really were testing everything. I feel like we are testing reproductive skills, nothing creative. And then Monique says, what's your opinion about testing skills theoretically? In the Netherlands, we test literally everything, and then mostly theoretically. So we are not testing creativity, for example. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so this is a real challenge for me because one of the things I realize is, you value what you test, right? Or you value what you assess. And so the things like you can say creativity is important, but at the end of the day, if you don't test it, then it doesn't matter, right? So, for example, in the United States, across the board, all of the exams are just canceled, and people don't know what to do because it's everything. It's what university you get into. It determines funding for schools. It tells you it's how people decide where to live, the grade that the school gets, right? It's a big deal, you know? And I know exams are a big deal in the Netherlands as well, right? So I know, but it sets up the track you go into, right? So the exam for my son, who's now, he's 14 at the beginning of high school, because he did well in exams last year, he'll probably would have done well in exams this year. He would have been locked into the college prep side, right? And not vocational, which I think is completely silly.
Yeah.
Because I think both are necessary, so classes he wants to take that he won't be able to take because then he won't take the college prep class. And so with everything canceled, what has happened? And the answer is a lot of teachers are leaning into creativity because they're not teaching to the test.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's this thing that exists. And the challenge is, on the other hand, we know that when you assess creativity, it can lead to risk aversion. And so there's been some research journal articles I read about how when you grade the creativity of a project, for example, and you grade it on creativity, it actually leads to risk aversion and less creative work, right? So I think it's a real challenge to say, how do we assess creativity? Some of it is you can assess the creative process, right? And then some of it is you can assess certain elements of creativity, right? So you can there's statistically valid and reliable measures for assessing, for example, divergent thinking. But the challenge that I see is, again, if you make that emphasis, what ends up happening is you will end up getting people who then try to prep for divergent thinking tests, rather than really becoming divergent thinkers. And so what I would argue is, if you can't completely assess creativity and it backfires, what's the second best option? And I think it's to have students self-assess their creative work and their creative process, both the final work and the process involved. And then also the idea of having students that schools will also value things that they celebrate if they don't assess it, right? So it may not be that it's assessed heavily, but if you celebrate it, then you'll value it. And so I would give an example. Here in the U.S., sports are ridiculously huge, high school sports, and we don't assess the school basketball and football team, but we celebrate it like crazy, to the point where everyone knows that football is important. Everybody knows that. And so I would say, if we can't completely assess it, we can have students self-assess it, and we can celebrate it. And I think those are the big pieces. A final thought there is, some of it's just rethinking our practices. So allowing students to resubmit work, allowing them to have flexibility on what they turn in, things like that, I think will encourage the creative work as well in terms of assessment.
Beautiful. Because Petra, she also made a notion. She asked a question, but it has a little bit of an introduction. The introduction is as follows. Let's see where it starts. The first is, hey, John, I challenge my students to be creative. Some students will write a report based on information on the internet. Another one interviews someone, and another one creates a video. Previously, the students determined what they want to be assessed on, and she got comments because assignments can be assessed differently. So our question is, how do you see this? And do you see a solution for the assessment without sacrificing creativity?
Yeah, that's a big challenge, because you want to have options, but then students expect things to be assessed fairly, and that means have a common assessment. So what I found to be really helpful there is to do two things. One is to have a broad rubric that covers particular skills that they'll demonstrate in different ways, right? So let's say you have a section that's on research, you have a section that's on ideation, you have a section that's on because I came up with a launch process. Like, I have a launch rubric, for example. So it's assessing you on your inquiry, your ideation, your research, your revision. And I found that to be a really helpful way to assess it across, and still allow for multiple areas of choice. The other thing that I'll say can sometimes be helpful is and again, that's really assessing it on the process. The other one is to focus on specific learning targets of what you want them to learn, and then assess those very specific learning targets in a really small, informal way.
Mhm.
And then the bigger project that they do isn't necessarily assessed.
Okay.
But it contributes to the learning. So there's a couple different ways you can do it, but it is a challenge. And I will point out, I still run into that challenge even at the university level. There's, people are going to really want to focus on fairness, and if it feels like it's unfair, you're going to get called out for it.
Yeah, very recognizable. Then the last question that I want to hold on to you is, do you think there is going to be a Corona or COVID-19 generation? Will they be more creative or less? What's your take on that? Stave is asking this question.
Yeah, I love that. I don't know. I think they're going to be maybe more resilient, have a little more of a growth mindset than other generations, if I had to guess. But I think it's going to be really interesting. Everybody's very focused right now. Around me, so many people are focused on what are they not getting by missing school, and I am really intrigued by the question of what are they getting by missing school. And I think they might be more empathetic. I think they might be better divergent thinkers. I think they might be better at knowing how to collaborate in a blended way. I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And like you said, we don't know. Is this going to last 2 more weeks or 6 more months?
Yeah.
Because we were told, where I am, we were told it'll probably be mid-April to late
Easter,
April,
right? It was over by Easter, right?
Yeah. Easter. Oh, he's so amazing.
Everything would be up and running again.
Everything. It'll be huge.
Yeah.
The greatest.
But what I see is that there's also this Generation Z that is, and Generation Alpha that is growing up right now. They are already been giving this more empathetic, and they already, it seems that this crisis may only give even more weight to their qualities, because somehow this Generation Z is being taught by our generation, which is more the consuming generation, and gives more about status and stuff like that. And Generation Z doesn't seem to be that much into that. So this might be a big trigger for the mindset of Generation Z to be taken over by Generation Y, like us.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to see. It's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out.
Unfortunately, we can't predict it, right?
Right. And I will point out one of the books that I love on predicting the future is Philip Tetlock has a book called Super Forecasting, and I highly recommend that because it really is about this idea that experts are often really bad at predicting the future, but what does it actually take to be better at predicting? And it's things like being flexible, having a flexible mindset, gathering data from multiple places and things like that. So it's really an interesting read.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the tip. Can you show us where we can reach out to you again? Can you put that slide on again?
Yeah, absolutely.
Your books are for sale on Amazon, I believe.
Yes, yeah, they're on
Amazon.
Yeah, and you can find a link from my website
on
as
your
well.
website.
Yeah.
Okay, because in the Netherlands we have a Dutch Amazon called bol.com, and your books take about 3 weeks or so to ship over from there. So it's better to order through Amazon. There is a Dutch Amazon being launched last week or so. So
I didn't know.
That's my tip too.
Interesting.
It's better to buy them through Amazon.
Huh. Yeah, I would say I generally try to I generally try to have a new video out each week. So yes, yeah. It's not. I'm about to put it on Spotify though. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. So like I listen to even though I'm an iPhone user, I like Stitcher the best as my podcast go to. But yeah, thanks for that reminder. I had put that on a list of things I wanted to do, and I'm putting that higher up on my list to get the podcast to Spotify. Yeah.
Well, do it because then more people can
Yeah.
enjoy it. John, thanks for your time. Thanks for your inspiration. A lot of people are thanking you for your beautiful story and experiences. Some people that were at your first keynote at the Educational Design Expedition also who were watching. So
Oh,
that's
very.
cool. So
Yeah.
thanks again. And I think we will meet again in the future. We are going to get you through the
Yeah.
Netherlands
Thanks.
once again.
That'd be awesome. I would
When
love
when
that.
the borders will open and you're allowed to travel again,
Yeah.
we will make it happen.
I love. I loved the Netherlands. I loved it. Yeah.
So I'm going to round it up. Next week we have a new webinar with Trevor Muir. He's going to talk about the collaborative classroom, and that webinar will be around 3 p.m. Dutch time. So make sure that you tune in and you'll be there. Thanks for watching, and hopefully see you next week.